1 Corinthians chapter 7. Lesson 6, chapter 7. As we've been studying the letter of Paul, the apostle, to the church at Corinth, we know, or should know by now, they were dealing with many problems, multiple problems, several problems. They were experiencing a woman, one of the sisters there named Chloe, had written to Paul, and her household had written to Paul to let him know about these problems. And Paul, unable to go there, which would have been his choice, his ideal choice every time would be, well, they're suffering problems, I'm going to go there and see how it's going. Same thing with Galatia, that the churches in Galatia that we've been studying on Wednesday night. Short of being able to go there, the next best thing would be to write them a letter in response and send it as speedily as possible by one of his helpers. So in Corinth, that's what he did, just like he did with Galatia. And among those problems we saw were division and factious environment, a cliquish environment, getting behind preachers and such, to one extent or another. We saw last week there was a severe case of tolerance of sin, the sin first in the congregation, and then a tolerance of the sin by the rest of the congregation. And we talked about that in detail last week. They didn't do anything about it. Paul had to put his foot down a little bit and tell them, you have to do something about it. You have to act, purge out the leaven. Whenever there's sin in the church has to respond. Not to the sin in the world. The way to respond to sin in the world is to preach the gospel. But when it's in the church, further action has to be taken when it comes to that point. We are, in our lesson, at least to follow along here, we're skipping over chapter 6, but another problem that they were dealing with was fighting to the point of maybe going to the law, going to court against each other. He put an end to that, or he tried to. He said that's a disgrace, that brings reproach on the name of Christ. It does great damage to the cause of Christ whenever Christians take one another to court, to a heathen court. How does that make the church? How does that make Christians look? How does that make the church look? But then in chapter 7, he comes to another issue that was not really as practical, it seems, but at least maybe a doctrinal issue. It seems that they had some misgivings or misleadings about marriage. And maybe particularly a man and a woman coming together in marriage. Those who are married coming together as a man and wife. And then he branches that out to simply the concept of a man and a woman getting married. And he has to address this issue. Now, the institution of marriage is very ancient. In fact, it's way more ancient than anyone would normally give credit. It is. When was marriage created? Very beginning, wasn't it? The first man and woman, according to the Genesis record, the very first man and woman were the very first husband and wife. God created the institution of marriage. He instituted marriage. It's His creation, and that's where it originated. We read about that in Genesis 2. The more zoomed-in version of the creation account, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, are not two different accounts. They're really the exact same, two different accounts maybe, but not two different versions or totally different contradictory accounts. But Genesis 2 is just the zoomed-in version is how I like to look at it. And it tells us about the creation of the woman, particularly the man and the woman, and especially the woman for the man. And he saw his creation. It was not ideal for God to, in God's eyes, for the man to be alone. But after He created the woman and they were together, God was satisfied. He was pleased, and He said it was very good. So, like Adam and Eve, we learned from the Genesis record that their relationship was meant to be a standard and an example for all people to follow that would come after them to also engage in. So they would then marry man and wife, one woman, one man for life. On and on and on it would go. So in verse 24, it tells us, Genesis 2:24, that this was a practice that was to be always held among human beings. Well, like Adam and Eve, the ones who do enter marriage are in an honorable relationship. It's an honorable thing. The Scriptures consider it to be honorable. There are many in today's world that say the opposite, that it is unnatural. It is oppressive. It is not ideal, because you look in the animal kingdom, and the vast majority of the animal kingdom doesn't do any such thing. There are a few outliers. I think penguins, certain kinds of penguins may choose a mate for life, and very few others. So people say, you see, monogamy is not in man's nature. It's an old, outdated, really restrictive and harmful arrangement. Not true at all. That is couldn't be farther from the truth. God says, the one who invented marriage, says it's an honorable thing, it's a good thing, it is right. I'm going to go through this in chapter. Marriage exists simply because of God, and it exists with His blessing when it is done in the way that He has instructed it to be done. So it's a gift from God, really, and it's something that a man and his wife, both parties, man and wife, should treasure it and protect it with everything they have. It is above all relationships one to be fought for, really, with yourself, or along with your spouse, to protect the integrity of it and the holiness of it, if you will. Jesus talked about that in Matthew 19 when He was approached and he was trying to be trapped. Moses said this, well, what do you say? That was a typical way for the opponents of Jesus to try to trap Him, because if he speaks against Moses, he's in trouble. If he speaks for Moses, then they're going to pounce on that and say, well, then, what about this? So they tried to trap Him, but Jesus simply referred back to the Genesis account and said, this is the way that God said it should be. It was not God's will that man be able to divorce his wife for any cause whatsoever. Moses, he commanded Moses to put that in because you wouldn't be able to handle God's standard of marriage. So that's what Jesus said. I'm sure they really loved that. But it was the truth. He said what God really intends, and from the beginning it was one man, one woman for life, no exceptions. But then there was one merciful and gracious exception inserted into the new covenant, which was fornication or adultery. So, when a person honors God's marriage plan, the potential of marriage is great. And it will come to that potential whenever we honor what God's plan for marriage is. Selfishness has no place. He's going to touch on this as well. The husband loves his wife in a way that mirrors the way Christ loves the church. That's Ephesians 5. The wife proves that proves her worth, as the Proverbs writer said, Proverbs 31:10, far above rubies. Her worth is far above rubies by her attitude and her actions. So in our lesson text here, 1 Corinthians 7, hopefully will help us better appreciate God's plan for marriage. We'll be looking at the importance of intimacy and devotion to one another. So here's how he starts in 1 Corinthians 7. He starts it like this, and your version may vary. I've pointed out in the past, especially in our study of Galatians in chapter 2, The New Testament manuscripts are not going to have quotation marks ever. So, and quotation marks are pretty important from our perspective, aren't they? Because they let you know that what is written in between those marks is something that has been said before, something that somebody else said. It's a quote. That's why we call them quotation marks. Well, whether your version may or may not have quotation marks in verse 1, the ESV does. And it says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote." So that alone already tells us Paul is responding to a concern of a matter about which they had written to him. This is one of those things, like the sexual immorality in the church, like the factiousness. In fact, this may be something else that a letter that the church at large had written to him to ask about things. But that's why he brings this up. It seems kind of sudden, but he brings it up because they brought it up. So, about that thing that you wrote to me about, he says, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." Now, does anybody's version not have that in quotation marks? I probably should have looked at this before, but in my opinion, it changes it drastically if it does have it versus if it doesn't have it. According to what I'm seeing here, it looks like New King James does not. It's one of the newer ones that do not. I don't think Old King James ever has quotation marks either, and the Old American Standard for that matter. But most of the newer versions put quotation marks where a quotation is happening. And I find that to be helpful, assuming that they put them in the right place, So if this is the reason that quotation marks make such a big difference in this verse is because with the quotation marks, it becomes the thing that they wrote to him about. That's the thing that they wrote. They wrote that. That's coming from them. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. If there's quotation marks, that means that's what they said, and he's going to address that. If it doesn't have quotation marks, then that would leave open the possibility that this is what Paul is saying about the matter about which they wrote. See the difference? That would mean that Paul is actually starting this discussion by saying that it is indeed good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And as long as we interpret it correctly in the context, either one, both can work. It seems to me that it makes more sense in my mind, in this moment at least, that he's quoting them. And that's how we'll go through this on down the verses. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Is that verse 25? 26. 26, which is, if you notice, outside of our text here, it's still very important because it is a contextual element that is crucial to a proper understanding of some of the advice that Paul gives. He says that basically his advice regarding whether a person should marry or not marry is exclusively and explicitly in connection with this present distress that was going on at that time. They are his suggestions are not necessarily across the board in all circumstances at all times by all people, but he says, in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain single. Can't emphasize that enough because there are many people who take Paul out of context and say that the Bible would suggest that celibacy and remaining single is somehow inherently spiritually better than being married. That is so far from the truth, as we already pointed out in the introduction about God instituted marriage, and He seemingly didn't even give Adam a choice. So if celibacy was better, then why would He even create the woman? for the man. Because if man never didn't even have woman to pair with him, then, that would have, it doesn't make any sense. And it's not scriptural by any means. Paul says, in view of what was going on at that time, which if we have time, we'll look more into that. Dean, did you have something? Okay. So, concerning the matters about which he wrote, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. It seems that they had been, that this philosophy had come into their congregation, that it is actually good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But we have to make note that there's no distinction in this statement between husbands and wives and just any old man and woman. If it is true that it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, that would mean even husband and wife shouldn't have sexual relations. So he's going to address whether or not that is true, that it is. There are some groups, I think in some, maybe not all Catholic groups, but some, at least if you go deep enough into their catechism and their set of standards, that there is supposedly something fleshly and worldly and sinful, dirty about sexual relations, even within the bounds of a scriptural marriage. And again, if that were true, then why would God make that the only way to multiply and then tell the man and woman to multiply? But why would that? God's going to tell them to do something sinful? So nowhere do the scriptures suggest that sexual relations within a scriptural marriage are something to be frowned upon, and that you will be greater spiritually if you don't have those relations with your wife. But Paul is going to say quite the opposite. Dean? Yeah. That's not to say that relation cannot be abused, because it can and it shouldn't be. So here's what he says. Because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. What does that mean? He's using big words. Conjugal rights. Yeah. Fancy, Paul. Anybody want to paraphrase? We're all adults here. You can paraphrase if you want. What is? Okay. He's saying the exact opposite of what that verse 1 statement said. It is not true that it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. That is not true. Now, there are qualifications to that, marriage being the main one, scriptural marriage. So he says, and then he starts with the reason. He says the reason why it would be a bad idea for a husband and wife to indefinitely withhold sexual intimacy is because that will create temptations of sexual immorality. Right? It will. In most cases, more so for the man than the woman, admittedly. But that's not to say that women would not experience that same temptation eventually or under certain circumstances. So Paul says basically the total opposite. Man and wife should absolutely come together. Not just once, but the implication is this will be a regular thing. He says, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Ooh, boy, you want to offend somebody. You tell them that. There's that evil, wicked, sexist Bible talking again. Doesn't the Bible say that a woman doesn't even, the man is the one that has authority over the woman's body? She don't even have authority over her own body. Can't imagine anything more sexist than that. Well, you need to keep reading, sweetheart, okay? Likewise, the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but the wife does. See, it's easy to take things out of context. You just rip that middle sentence out, and the Bible's the most sexist thing. It's exactly what they're always going on about. Men ruling over women, lording over women, even to the point that they don't even have authority over their own body. Well, he says exactly the same thing about the man and the woman. The wife has the same authority over her husband's. Maybe we should stop and ask this. What does that mean? That the wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and vice versa. What does that mean? In context, what do you think it means? The key, there's a big hint in the red text that we just talked about. The red on the screen, not in your Bible, but on the screen. The word for, yeah, go ahead. Okay. In context, since he says the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights and vice versa. That is, the husband should see to the needs of his wife and the wife should see to the needs of her husband. For, there's that word ties in both of what's before and after. The wife, in other words, doesn't have the right to withhold her own body from her husband, ignoring his needs and selfishly saying, I don't care about your needs. And the husband doesn't have the right. Now, sure, there are circumstances when mutual understanding should be involved. If the wife or the husband is not feeling well, there are plenty of things. Got the flu or something. That's not within the bounds of what Paul is talking about. The husband, this principle of not having authority over our own body, I would suggest is not for the other person's mindset. It's for your mindset. So, in other words, it's not the husband who should use this passage and tell the wife, you don't have authority over your own body. I do. But it's the wife who should look at that and tell herself, I don't have authority over my own body, but my husband does. And the husband should look at it and say, I don't have authority over my own body. Not the other way around. It's for the person within him or herself to have this state of mind in this connection. Not to use against the other one, but to yourself, this is the way God wants it to be. Yes? Yeah.
That's what marriage is all about. Being a companion, being a helper. And that's just it. If you don't want to be the helper, then how do you get married in the first place?
Yeah.
And that's why when God created Eve back in the beginning, He created a helper, someone, a companion that wants to please her husband, and vice versa, the husband wants to please his wife.
Yeah. That's how it should be. Seeking the pleasure of the other. In multiple ways, not just sexual ways. That's just the context of this chapter. But it's not limited to that. So then in verse 5, the last verse of this section, he basically sums it up. He says, don't deprive one another. That's the point. Do not deprive one another in that connection. Except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again. That is, after that, you need to come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. That goes back to the way he started this part, because of the temptation of sexual immorality. So he says, do not, under any circumstance, deprive one another sexually. However, it's almost like he just had a thought all of a sudden that occurred to him. Unless, there would be a mutual agreement that you two have between one another that you're going to fast. We've talked about fasting before and how fasting doesn't have to be just about food. You can fast from other things too, including sex. That's basically what he's talking about here. If you have an agreement that, for the rest of this week or whatever, we're going to withhold, we're going to abstain from that intimacy and devote ourselves to prayer. But Paul is saying, even if you're going to do that, you need to make sure that the very next day, the day that it's over, you come back together to avoid any possible temptation to sexual immorality because of lack of self-control. Yes, sir.
Well, the thing of it is, when God created man and woman, He created the desire in each one of them. Sexual desire, God put in man, and all three put in woman. So there's nothing wrong with it because of the fact that God was the one that put it in the first place. Now, if He did one thing, then when He created Adam, He wouldn't have put that desire in him. Just like the woman.
Yeah.
The desire in him, and that's the same with us too. Even today, we all have that desire that is in us and born in us. God
Yep.
put it there,
Yep.
and it's a natural thing.
Absolutely.
There's some limitations and some rules, and we have guidelines, and we have to go by it. We just can't, because God gave us, we're not free to do whatever we want to with anybody and everyone. No, it was like you said, it was from the beginning, one man and one woman.
Yep. And it is used in that way a lot of times that, and He put that in men so that they would go around like animals, dogs, and the first they will plant their seed so they can reproduce. That's why God did that. No. Self-control is a huge part of being right with God, and that is just another opportunity to train ourselves in self-control, is because of those desires. Yep.
Maybe we should go back just a little bit.
Okay. How far?
Well, but maybe people should consider why they're getting married to start with.
Yeah. It's a good question to ask. With anything, really. Here's something that I'm going to do. Why am I wanting to do this? With marriage, there are multiple right answers, but there's also plenty of wrong answers, So why? So if a man and a woman get in this position where they are not doing as Paul is instructing here, or really commanding, then that would be a valid question, why did we get married to each other? Maybe we were a bit hasty, Yeah, Dean?
Well, too, him said children are afraid on each side.
Mm-hmm.
The man has pleasure, the woman has. So, it's something that God created in man from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And it wasn't something that, we take lightly. Marriage is something that, especially nowadays, people are taking so lightly that, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Back then, marriage did mean something.
Yep.
And when we were growing up, yes, marriage did mean something. But nowadays, in these generations now, marriage is nothing.
Mm-hmm.
You don't like to get married, you don't like the person, maybe a couple of years or a week, two, whatever,
Yeah, just not working out,
and get another one.
Yeah, the sanctity of marriage. See, that's another thing is, it's really a blessing of God that He in it has done. They are with more ways to be able to partake of it without the purpose of it altogether, or the consequences of it. So man, in typical fashion, finds ways to try to exploit and abuse a good part of something, not have any consequences or ramifications of that. And, with sex, obviously, that would be pregnancy or STDs, things like that, but mainly pregnancy. So, I believe that anybody should be able to have sex with anybody they want, anytime they want, but that's going to cause a lot of women to get pregnant. Well, what if we found a way to keep women from getting pregnant? And there is plenty of inventions for that. Or what if we changed the law and made it so that women can just kill the baby if they happen to get pregnant? We'll do that. You see, all these are ways to simply make it so that based on their own demonic, really insatiable desires, be all the more accessible without the consequence. When God created this intimacy to be exclusively within the scriptural marriage relationship, period. And a man and a wife does neither have the right to say, regularly or indefinitely, just say no. It's not going to happen. Period. Not just not tonight because I'm sick or whatever, but just always understood that they don't come together. Paul says that's horrible. That is a terrible, terrible thing. Not just when you're trying to have a baby, but period, ever. He says, further instruction in verse 6, he says, now, as a concession, not a command. Now notice that's very crucial also here. Paul is never afraid to inform, and rightly so, when he's just offering his own Spirit-inspired advice, not a command from the Lord. And he's going to flip that in a few verses and say, now what I'm about to tell you is from the Lord. It's not just a concession, it's from the Lord. But here he says, now this is just a concession. In other words, this is just a suggestion. He says, I wish that all were as I myself am. What do you mean? A man? A Jew? A Pharisee? What's he mean? Single, yeah. Unmarried. And as far as we know, he was never married. So he says, I wish that all were as I myself am. And he's going to back this up. He's going to explain what he means. He says, but each has his own gift from God. One of one kind, one of another kind. To the unmarried and to the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am. There's the answer. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So, he says, if it were up to me, I would like it if everybody were single. And he's not done clarifying this, okay? And I'll just go ahead and spoil it. He goes on to say, for one thing, people who are single are going to be better off in view of this present distress that he gets into later in the chapter. Also, people who are single are able to dedicate themselves entirely to the Lord. Whereas people who marry have a responsibility, if possible, in their own physical makeup to recreate. Some women are barren, and some men are sterile and things like that. But as long as they're physically able, they have a responsibility to, God would have us to bear children and to raise families. And that takes a lot of time, doesn't it? And money. People put out statistics of how many hundreds of thousands of dollars it takes to raise a child to 18. I don't pay attention to them because I don't even want to know. Just don't tell me, because I got 3 of them. Don't even tell me. I don't want to know. If you know, keep it to yourself, because it'll make me sick. I'm not keeping track. I don't even want to know. I'm going to ignore it. But it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of your time and energy, which the way Paul's looking at it is takes away then from time that you are reasonably able to use serving the Lord. Yeah, Dean?
In marriage, men through the years have been true to everybody, they wouldn't have to worry about this disease.
Mm-hmm.
The longer you're taking they live to be 100 or 200 years old, and they didn't have sex with people and stuff, they will not have to worry about ever having any type of sexual disease. Because that's how God becomes man.
Yeah.
Whenever you start having a man and a woman start having multiple partners, then that's where God could cause that to be diseases is going to happen.
Yeah.
But as long as you are spiritually married, you don't have to worry about it.
Yep. It's almost physically impossible to get one in that if both are virgins when they are married. Of course, there are, I guess, very, very rare and flukish circumstances that can cause somebody to get a disease that can be sexually transmitted that wasn't, maybe hereditary, something like that, or severe. I'm not sure if it's even the way it works, but as a rule, you don't have to worry about it if people would just do what God's will is in that way. So many problems would be avoided. Children who don't have fathers in the home would not be a problem if people would honor God's plan for marriage. Teenage pregnancy, unmarried teenage pregnancy. I guess a woman and a man could get married in their late teens, and technically that's teenage pregnancy, but if they have a baby, but not necessarily what we call teenage pregnancy. All these kinds of things would not happen if people would just honor God's will in the matter. And what would be the harm in it? To not, why is it so mocked and laughed at for people to suggest that to remain abstinent until marriage? The world laughs at that deliberately to make people feel like a joke if they do that. Like it's so outlandish. Well, what real substantial benefit or blessing does the world have by being promiscuous through their whole teenage years until they get married? What do they have from that? Well, experience, then I can make my wife more happy. Okay, well, maybe I'll speak for myself. I think I would rather learn along the way with my wife now than to be able to say, I have more experience now because I've been with all these other women. I don't think that would be much of a consolation to my wife, and it's not shallowness for that to create a barrier between a man and wife to know that the other has had multiple partners. People would say, well, you need to get over yourself and stop being so shallow. I don't think that's shallow at all. It's natural, that jealousy for your mate. Yes, sir.
The invention of contraceptives and abortions.
Yep.
That's what propagated this thing.
Yeah. And, the Catholic Church is very anti-birth control. I would not go so far as to say that birth control is a sin, because not every woman takes birth control as a teenager. I don't know, that's not wise, but I will say that studies have shown extensively that birth control is not good for women. It is not good. Almost across the board, they are more and more learning and coming out to say that it is not good for a woman's system to be on those birth controls. It really messes up their hormonal levels and other things that they need along the way. But from a spiritual perspective, it's not inherently, in certain circumstances, sinful. But you have to look at why if I would not want my teenage daughter to be put on birth control. There's no reason. She already has birth control. The most powerful birth control there is. So, doesn't need it. The only method of birth control that is 100.00% effective is abstinence. And there are so many benefits along the road, especially for women, because men are going to look on this, frown upon it more than a woman would if her husband has had multiple partners, than a man would for his wife to have had multiple partners. So for women especially, this is why I think it is so dangerous that we are instilling in our young women and girls today that they ought to be historically like the men who have historically been the ones, who who go around and are promiscuous and seemingly get away with it, because people don't judge boys the way they judge girls. Well, I think it will be much greater for mankind and society to raise up the girls and young ladies of our culture to be better than the boys, because you are better in that way. So there are reasons why that will come back to haunt, especially women, later in their marriages. There's nothing good that can come from it, period. So that shouldn't even be in the question. But Paul is talking more about not what happens when a man and wife are no longer having sexual intimacy. Danger is around the corner, especially now more than then even. Because you think about how much more easy it is now to access content that a man or woman can use to satisfy their own desires out of lack of self-control. Much easier than it was back then. You couldn't just access pornography so easily 2,000 years ago. The things that people can see today, you would have to actually go to a woman and ask her to show it to you. You can't just type it in anonymously on your computer and hope that nobody knows or finds out. But you can do that today. So even more so, it is dangerous for a man and woman not to come together, a man and his wife to come together, because of a lack of self-control and temptations of sexual immorality. So he says, do not do that. But come together regularly. It is healthy, it is right, and it increases the bond, or should be done in a way that increases the bond. I want to add one more thing. We're out of time. We can't get to the rest of it, but I do want to add one other thing. Whenever Paul talks about the husband giving to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband, yes, he's talking in a sexual context, but I would submit that most women do not have the same desire and drive in that regard as men do. But the things that a man can do for a woman that give her the same sort of satisfaction emotionally and inwardly as a woman could give to her husband in that area are in other areas, aren't they? Like emotional support, just love and affection and gentleness and tenderness and maybe protection and things like that. So when we talk about a husband seeing to the needs of his wife, it's not just sexual. It's not just sexual with men either and the wife. But even more so, with a husband to his wife, what are you doing to see to her needs in those areas? Are you being loving and affectionate and tender and kind and those things? Because that's just as important as her seeing to your needs in the sexual realm. So, something to think about for us husbands and wives. If we're not giving our wives her conjugal rights in those areas, then it's going to be a lot more difficult for her to not take control over her own body and withhold herself from you. And vice versa. It all goes together. It's never one-sided. But every single instruction of wives to their husbands and husbands to their wives, it all is so much easier if both are doing as they should be. When you treat each other the way God expects you to treat each other, it's going to be so much easier for you to treat each other the way God wants you to treat each other. And the biggest barriers and obstacles to God's standard of a marriage relationship is whenever one side stops doing it. And then the excuses come in, and it becomes much more difficult for a wife to be the wife she ought to be to her husband when her husband's not being the husband he ought to be to her. And it's so much harder for a husband to be the husband God expects him to be when his wife is not being the wife that he expects her to be. So marriage is great for human society, and it needs to be upheld, protected, and intimacy, physical intimacy even, is a very important part of that, because it, if nothing else, reduces the chances of temptation to sexual immorality.